welcome you to the May 23rd, 2024 electronic meeting of the Environmental Commission. We are continuing to meet remotely subsequent to changes made according to COVID distancing. We intend to conduct this meeting similar to an in-person meeting, so I ask that you be patient if there are technical issues. Public comment is welcome and will be by telephone only. To speak at public comment, call 888-788-0099 and enter meeting ID 962-0336-6453. This information is available on the published agenda in the public notices section of the city website and on the broadcast of this meeting on CTN channel 13, and on AT&T channel 99 and online at a2gov.org/watchctn. And that is the end of the opening statement. Once again, thanks everyone. And I would ask Erin to read our land heritage statement.
Thanks, Rita. I acknowledge that the land the city of Ann Arbor occupies is the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Anishinaabe, including Odawa, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi and Wyandot peoples. I further acknowledge that our city stands, like almost all property in the United States, on lands obtained generally in unconscionable ways from Indigenous peoples. The taking of this land was formalized by the Treaty of Detroit in 1807. Knowing where we live, work, study, and recreate does not change the past, but a thorough understanding of the ongoing consequences of this past can empower us to work in our work to create a future that supports human flourishing and justice for all individuals.
Thank you, Erin. Let's all respect the land as it has been in the past. Would you now call the roll, please?
Yes. Councilmember Ackman?
Here, Ann Arbor.
Vice Chair Brown is absent. Commissioner Callowart?
Here.
Commissioner Curtis?
Here, Ann Arbor.
Commissioner Dale?
Here in Ann Arbor.
Councilmember Dish?
Here, Ann Arbor.
Commissioner Graham?
Here, Ann Arbor.
Commissioner Gruber?
Here in Ann Arbor.
Commissioner Marson?
I'm here in Ann Arbor.
Commissioner Mirsky? Absent. Chairperson Mitchell?
Here in Ann Arbor.
Commissioner Nedrich?
Ann Arbor.
And Commissioner Wahing. Absent.
Oh.
Here is Commissioner Mirsky coming in here.
All right, good. So at this point, I would like to ask for a motion to approve today's agenda. I see Commissioner Curtis in a second. Commissioner Dale, thank you very much. Is there any discussion of the agenda? Seeing no hands, I'm going to ask all who approve to raise your hand, say aye, indicate. All right, looks like approval. Thank you. I'd like to now ask for approval of our minutes from the April meeting. That would be April 28th. Sorry, a motion to approve. From Commissioner Gruber, thank you. And a second from Commissioner Nedrick, thank you. Any discussion of the minutes from last month? Seeing no hands. All who approve the minutes from last month, please raise your hand now. And we are approved. Thank you. So let's now move into public commentary. This is the first of two public commentary options for the Environmental Commission. This is an opportunity for persons to speak for up to 3 minutes. Please call 888-788-0099 and enter meeting ID 962-0336 6453. Thank you, Aaron. City staff will select callers that have raised their hand by calling on out the last 3 digits of your phone number. In order to electronically raise your hand, please press *9 on your phone. You'll hear an automated announcement that the host is allowing you to speak. At that point, press *6 to unmute your phone. When speaking, please move to a quiet area and mute any television or background sounds so that we may hear you clearly. Please state your name and address at the beginning of your comments. So that's that part. Aaron, do you see anyone who is here to make a public comment?
I do not.
All right, then let's move on to our business, which is last month, and actually the month prior, we had discussions of the resolution to support revising our public street stormwater management guidelines policy. We had a first reading of it. We had a discussion with staff in a small group outside of our main meeting here, and had many questions answered. And I'd like to now just see if there are any additional questions that the commission would like to discuss among ourselves, and consider approving the policy as written. I see Commissioner Dale.
Not a question, so much as the one. I was very thankful for them spending the time answering all of our questions. I know that they're very busy, so that was great. And it did answer almost all of my questions. The only thing that it didn't address was a concern that I have, that in removing the language that is sort of specifically aimed at the nature-based green solutions to stormwater, and I understand why they're removing it, but in removing that language, I think it might be creating a gap, because I don't think the landscape ordinance or anything else that I'm aware of on the books, it sort of fills that space for encouraging, requiring, incentivizing greenery in that right of way. And I understand it's not always possible, but I worry that we, in doing this without specifically calling that out, that there might be overall, we might accidentally create this trend where there's going to be less of that. And I think that there are other co-benefits of that greenery, like addressing the heat island effect and other things that would become an issue, right? We're losing those co-benefits as well. So, I'm not wanting to throw a wrench in this, but I think I would like it if somehow our approval is also saying, hey, we think that this could be a gap, and is that something that we could ask staff to look at and find a way to account for that somewhere else? So just, that's my 2 cents on this.
Yeah, great comment. I would appreciate, I see that Jerry Hancock is here. And I wonder if, Jerry, is there a way that you can address that as an issue of how we can do that? Because it is one that's actually one that I have a concern about. And thank you for voicing that, Anya.
Yeah, so there's a couple things that come to mind. For one is with the wording in there about green infrastructure, we felt like we weren't delivering what it said in the policy, because we weren't finding as many opportunities as we were for underground. Now, from a practical standpoint, it costs more to build underground detention than it does to build green infrastructure. So it's, our designers are going to tend towards designing something green if there's room for it, because it will cost less to do that. It will maybe create a little more maintenance cost in the future, but the designer is going to want to fit the green infrastructure in over the underground stuff. While it doesn't say that in the policy, that's just sort of the practical end of it.
And I appreciate that. And I'm not suggesting, when I say could we consider specifically asking if this is something staff could look like, I'm not necessarily saying stormwater staff, right? Just like collectively somewhere in other ordinances and other programs. Like, is there something that can sort of maybe fill that gap? So I realize that this might not necessarily be the specific spot for it, but yeah. So I hear what you're saying, and I understand that and appreciate that as well. So thank you.
Commissioner Mirsky? Let's
Yes.
not drop that. But yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I've looked at the new policy or guidelines, and it seems to me that the changes are prudent. I have one concern, and that is, as I understand it, the old document that this is replacing is called a policy. And I understand the policy to be something that sets out requirements. You shall do this, you shall do that. The new document is called a guideline or a guidance, or no, a guideline. And it also includes a section that's called notes. And it seems to me that, at least as I interpret it, we're moving from things that are mandated and are regulatory to something that is moving again from shall to may. And I'm wondering if my understanding of the nomenclature that's used is indeed indicative of a change in how the policy, quote unquote, or the guideline will be applied.
So that is not being changed. That's the same wording that is the existing policies starts out, says policy statement, and it uses the word guidelines in the title of the current policy. So that's not proposed to be changed.
Okay. And so these notes, so everything is a guideline, and it's not a policy.
Well, if it were, I mean, yes, it's a guideline. We would put it in code if it were a must.
Mm-hmm.
But since city code doesn't necessarily apply to city projects, this was our tool for accomplishing that.
So, I mean, for the record, these then are requirements.
Yes, that's how staff views them and
Right.
implements them, and then this is the requirement. City council, once council approves this, city council has said, staff, you shall do this.
Right. Okay, good. And just to understand one other thing that Chair Mitchell said, we're not approving this. We are being asked to approve a resolution recommending that council approve the new guideline. Is that correct?
Correct.
Good. Okay, great. Thanks for answering my questions.
Thanks, John. Councilmember Ackman?
Yeah, I don't quite understand what Anya said, and I want to. So I'm wondering if and it's perhaps because I wasn't at the last meeting and I wasn't part of the side conversation. So could you just clarify what you're afraid is going to be missing and that you would like to see covered elsewhere?
So, so if I'm understanding correctly, the part of the changes is to change the wording and take some of the emphasis off of making to be prioritized.
You just cut up there like
Yeah, something's missing.
the main point.
No.
You're good
Okay.
now.
All right, fingers crossed. Okay, so from what I was understanding, part of these changes is to, like the name being Green Streets. Like there's language throughout that made it seem very much like this, like what is calling for specifically vegetative solutions, right? And that is not necessary. That's not always feasible, not always appropriate for the spot. So I understand that, but as far as I'm aware, like the landscaping ordinance or other things that are out there, there's not anything that specifically would encourage, and I get that can't be required, but encourage as much as possible to have more vegetation in those areas, because there are other benefits totally aside from stormwater, right? Like resiliency, biodiversity, dealing with heat island effect and things like that. So separate from what we're talking about stormwater, I do worry that if there's nothing out there in other guidelines or ordinances or something that is encouraging that, over time, are we going to sort of accidentally start designing these out? And I think that could be at a detriment to the community. So I'm sort of zooming back, seeing big pictures. It's one of those things where we might have an unintended negative consequence that could be addressed by just asking somebody outside of the stormwater team. Even maybe it's sort of a bigger picture back, but like look at all of those guidelines, ordinances, all of those things, and to see if that is in fact a gap, and if so, could there be something that's created specifically to say that as part of our community resiliency, we do want to continue to look for those opportunities wherever possible, and make them native and climate adaptive and all of those things.
Thanks.
So it might belong somewhere else outside of this, and that's fine. But I don't want to lose track of that, I guess.
Thank you.
Commissioner Curtis.
So going back to the guidelines policy, both documents say that's a policy statement at the top. Both documents say it's a guideline in the text. The only difference is the file name. The file name of the green space existing document calls it a policy, and the file name of the new one calls it a guideline. So if there's any lingering question, we could probably just change the file name without changing any text in the document and make that go away.
So yeah, that sounds good to me. Who can answer that question? Is that Jerry or Aaron?
I mean, that's easily done. That's just changing the name of the file. We can do that.
And that doesn't even require a vote or anything, right? It's just the content is what's the important thing.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Well, that may help because the file will be loaded up into Legistar and to City Council, and people will see it as a policy. It is a policy, so probably a better title.
Okay. All right. So I do very much appreciate Commissioner Dale's comments about the green components. And I want to just call out something that I believe has happened as an example of reduction of opportunities for vegetation. And it's it's called something use buffer, combined use buffer. What is the C? The
It's like the
CLU?
land use buffer.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah. Didn't the dimensions of that spacing get reduced recently within the last 6 months or so? Commissioner Dish,
So the conflicting land use buffer legislation or ordinance in the code was changed because currently we require buffers between land uses that are the same, that do not conflict. So the code was requiring land use buffer between, say, a multifamily residential and a single family residential. And what that was doing was actually, in some cases, it could increase the space between structures by, well, I cannot remember off the top of my head, but by, I think, up to 20 feet, which goes in the opposite direction of our sustainability goals, because our sustainability goals are asking us to make more efficient use of space and allow for greater density on lots. The setbacks are still required. Tree replacement is still required. In almost any time you have a new development anywhere in the city, you are going to get stormwater management where there was none. And so that could be detention ponds, that could be bioswales. It would be bioswales as often as you could find it. So the conflicting land use buffer and this question of vegetation, it's really not the same thing. And the modifications to that conflicting land use buffer were motivated by the A20 goals.
Can you give
To encourage the density specifically?
To not create space between like uses, which doesn't need to be there. I mean, there's no reason, I mean, there's every reason to have a conflicting land use buffer between a primarily commercial use and a residential use. There is not a need to buffer between residential uses, even if they are of different, even if you're doing multifamily and single family residential, there's no reason to buffer those uses from each other. So
yeah, I was just asking more the goals of the A20 program. And so that goal, the intent there was to increase density. Is that correct?
Well, I mean, I wouldn't just put it that way. I would say that the goal is, excuse me, because, well, I would say that the goal simply is to use our land to not have gaping holes that become unusable because they're too small to build anything, but they're not necessary to have between buildings. So I don't think it's simply increased because you might not get a very big increase in density out of this, but you won't be wasting space.
Okay.
I can add a little bit to that. I was actually the staff person that was asked to write the section that has now been rescinded. It was a request of the Planning Commission about 15 years ago. It was not recommended by staff because in some cases it required two conflicting land use buffers right next to each other. So instead of 15 feet, you had 30 feet. And from a staff perspective, we were like, this is not a really great idea, but it was pushed ahead anyways. And so now a different group has taken it out years later.
Okay. All right. So I guess thank you for that explanation. One of the interpretations that I have or concerns that ways I see this proposal that we're talking about is that it allows staff flexibility to adjust or maybe select from a range of opportunities for stormwater management according to what's available in the land, meaning that if the soil is sand versus clay, there's a different method used for the management. Does that part of what this change was intended to do or to reflect how things are really done on the ground? No pun.
The majority of the changes are to reflect how we've been implementing it. So we wrote the code without implementing, or not, I'm sorry, not the code, the policy. We wrote the policy, and now we've implemented for 10 years and have discussed with the consultants that we've used, how are they experiencing the use of it, and plus other city staff that do road design. So we're not changing any of the parameters of it. So we have some soil infiltration thresholds. Those all stay the same. So basically, we're kind of just rewriting it to reflect how it is actually functioned for staff. And part of that is we weren't able to get as much green as we had hoped.
And when you say green in that context, do you mean vegetation or do you mean the result of?
I mean vegetation.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we were able to do more underground infiltration just because of the conflicts of all of the stuff that's in the right of way.
Okay. All right, thanks. So I've got one other question. If this is passed, I assume it likely will be by us and with council, when would it go into effect? Would that be an immediate?
Yeah, I believe it would work just like a code. It would go into effect 10 days after it's published, which is happens like a week after council approval.
Okay.
But being that this is not an ordinance, I mean, this is referenced in our public services standard specifications, and so
Mhm.
we will just swap out the new version for the old version, which is no longer a book. It lives online.
All right, great. Um, and is there with that kind of effectiveness, I guess we can assume that the approaches that are reflected in the document would be used right now in projects that are ongoing, like today.
Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And there's two specific things I should point out that are expansion of this. It may be difficult if you're not a stormwater manager, but we specifically say in there that we are going to use the full right-of-way width for the calculation. And previously we were only using the disturbed area. So one of the results of this is the volume of infiltration that will be required on each project will increase. And the other change is in the note section. It specifically says for utility projects that take out at least half width of a road, that at the time of CIP, we are going to consider whether or not that utility project is a good candidate for meeting this policy as far for stormwater management. So that's something that's not happening now. So
Mhm.
those two things are an expansion of the policy.
That sounds good. And here's my last one. There was a reference to a letter of map revision for Allen Creek. Did that happen? It was supposed to happen in April, I think.
So that's a different topic, but I happen to be the
Whoops.
person doing that. So I can answer that. Yes, we have applied to FEMA for a letter of map revision for the entire Allen Creek watershed. And this is related to the Allen Creek berm project, the openings that we put under the railroad. When we had applied to FEMA to change just the lower reach, the area that we actually changed with the project, they said, oh no, you have a different model and the way these things match up, that you're going to have to modify all of Allen Creek. Well, we didn't have the budget for that. We had to find the money. It caused a year delay, but we have finally got our contractor on board, and we've finished the application. The application went into FEMA about a month ago. So it's being reviewed by them. They have 3 months to do their first review. We'll see what happens. But even though I won't be here, we have hired my replacement, and she will finish this project up. She has a lot of experience in floodplain mapping, so you'll still be in good hands to finish that project.
Okay. Well, we've been in your good hands for a long time, and thank you, Jerry, for this. Are there any other questions from the commission on this topic? I see no hands. So I would appreciate a motion in support of the resolution in support of revising the public street stormwater management guidelines policy. I see Chris Graham and seconded by Sarah Nedrick. Thank you very much. So all in favor of the policy change?
Aye.
All right. Any opposed? All right. It passes. Thank you, Jerry. You did it again.
Thank you.
And congrats on your next move, whatever it is.
All right. Thanks.
All right. Thank you, everyone. We're going to move on to new business. And this is a different kind of approach or topic that I appreciate the assistance that we're getting tonight and presentation by Christy McGillivray, who's the political and legislative director of the Sierra Club Michigan chapter. She will talk with us tonight about CAFOs, concentrated animal feeding operations, and their
Rita, I
Uh-oh.
haven't seen her join yet.
Oh, well, I see her.
Here.
I see her picture.
Oh, she's here.
Yeah,
Oh,
she
okay.
made it.
Apologies. Continue.
That's okay. Thanks, and hi, Christy. I just wanted to be welcome you to our meeting, and I want to just say that I appreciate the work that you are doing for the state and all communities involved with many serious issues that we're dealing with. And with that, I will just allow you to proceed. And everyone, please be ready with questions because this will be really interesting.
Thanks, Rita. And Rita, the presentation, you turned my PowerPoint into a PDF. Are you going to be
Yes.
sharing that, or should I share that?
If you can share it, it would be great. Or
Sure.
perhaps Erin can help. I don't know where we are with that.
Yeah, happy to do whatever works best for you.
If you could share it, Erin, that would be fantastic.
Sure. Yep.
Thank you. Folks, I appreciate your patience. I did not put this presentation together strictly for this meeting. This is a presentation that I gave recently at the MDP Rural Summit on Sierra Club's agricultural priorities, but it covers CAFOs. So I am repurposing it, and I appreciate that. So thanks, Erin. And I'm assuming that most folks on this call are familiar with CAFOs, stands for Concentrated Animal Feeding Operations. We have quite a few in Michigan. And I think actually I will skip the conversation about PFAS in agriculture unless I'm happy to go through this. Are folks interested in the PFAS in agriculture conversation? I don't know how much time we have.
I think we are in a good place, Christy,
Okay.
in terms of our time. So,
Okay.
I think it is a very important issue, and we have discussed PFAS. It's really too bad that Steve Brown isn't here tonight because he's our PFAS expert, but
Mhm.
you know, we're happy to have you.
Great. I mean, well, Steve is very well aware of all of this. So
Mhm.
I am happy to go over PFAS in agriculture. There is overlap with
Yep.
CAFOs and PFAS in agriculture. So it's not a wholly unrelated topic, but it is a priority for Sierra Club. So we can get into it. All right. So next slide. So for folks that are not aware, most of our sludge from wastewater treatment plants, they're called biosolids in the industry. Most of the sludge from human waste actually winds up on land. And the photo there on the right, Milorganite, that is a product that you can buy in most hardware stores. If you see, it says there's the little eco-friendly label down on the bottom. That's wastewater treatment sludge from a wastewater treatment plant in Milwaukee. So it is actually trademarked and sold, and folks are not aware that they are buying heat-treated human waste. And there's a lot of stuff in there. It's, you know, when our waste goes through a wastewater treatment plant, it's not just human waste, there's everything else in there. And there's a lot of really concerning materials that can be found in leftover wastewater treatment sludge, including PFAS, because of the ubiquity of PFAS compounds in all of our consumer products. So next slide. So this kind of goes through the cycle. We treat for heavy metals and viruses and pathogens, but we don't treat for any of the huge numbers of synthetic chemicals that are in so many different products. We really don't have a good disposal option. It's not possible to stop producing human waste, for example. So the real core solution with how we deal with human waste is upstream solutions and making sure that we are using as many non-toxic materials as possible. That's the primary solution. The actual treatment of it on the back end is almost impossible. So I think it points to the upstream solution as an absolute must. Okay, next slide. So as this slide shows, most of it is land applied, and this is where we get the overlap with CAFOs, because human waste can actually be applied on land that is used for animal agriculture. That is not always the first use for wastewater treatment sludge, but it does happen and it leads to the bioaccumulation of persistent organic pollutants up the food chain. All right, next slide. So I think folks are probably familiar with Grostic Farms. Jason Grostic's beef farm outside of, it's in Brighton, outside of Brighton, was contaminated with wastewater treatment plant sludge coming from the Wixom wastewater treatment plant. And I think folks in Ann Arbor are very familiar with the Wixom wastewater treatment plant because that is the source of PFAS contamination in the Huron River, which has definitely affected Ann Arbor. So Jason Grostic's farm was shut down by the state. He allowed the state to come in and test the beef from his cattle, and the levels of PFAS that were found in the beef that had grazed on the land where he had wastewater treatment sludge applied for years, it had built up in his herd and it had contaminated his herd. I do want to note that Jason Grostic was not running a CAFO. However, he's the only farmer in the state that allowed the state to actually test his cows, and that was the result. It's really a tragedy and pretty upsetting. And it points to the need to make sure that we're holding the companies that are profiting from the production of PFAS accountable for the financial fallout. And we need to make folks like Jason Grostic whole. Next slide. We've seen this in Maine as well. It's popping up around the entire state. And this is a story about Adam Nordell's farm. And for folks that are interested, Adam Nordell from Maine is actually going to be at the University of Michigan. I forget exactly when, but there's a national PFAS conference that this year is going to be at U of M. And Adam Nordell is going to be there talking about the work that he's doing now to keep farmers from experiencing financial hardship when they find out that their land is contaminated with PFAS because of legacy wastewater treatment sludge that was spread. Next slide. It's happening all over the country. It's not just a Michigan problem. It's truly nationwide. So this is just an example of all the different states that are starting to test and find PFAS because of our history of spreading wastewater sludge on agricultural land. Next slide. This was a study that Sierra Club did with Ecology Center. So I highly encourage, if folks haven't read it yet, we did some independent testing of fertilizers that you could buy just in regular hardware stores. And we found PFAS in all of them. So it's pretty alarming. Next slide. So this is where the wastewater treatment sludge and CAFOs overlap. So this is a timeline of a hog CAFO that is right on the border between Oceana and Newaygo counties in Michigan. And the history of this particular parcel of land, it's quite a big farm, so multiple parcels, is that a leather company, a tannery, bought the land, and in the 1990s, they started applying their tannery waste as compost to this land. At some point in the early 2000s, they were primarily just growing corn on the land where they were spreading tannery waste. In the early 2000s, a hog CAFO opened up. It dramatically expanded, and now it is one of the largest hog CAFOs in the state. And the soil and the groundwater in that area are heavily contaminated with PFAS, as well as some other really alarming heavy metals because of the content of the tannery waste. And at the time, it was trademarked and sold as beneficial soil conditioner under the BU3 program through the state. And it points to this overlap between waste management and agricultural policy that has unintended consequences that are generational, and we often really are able to track and quantify after the fact when the damage has already been done. So, for example, at Valley View Pork, the hog farm where they were spreading tannery waste, the well water on the property was severely contaminated and it was deemed unfit for human consumption. However, there were migrant workers that were drinking out of that contaminated water for decades, up until MPART stepped in and really worked to mitigate the problem. So it wasn't until MPART tracked this site down as a legacy contamination site that anyone who was drinking from those contaminated wells was properly protected. So it's not a great history. It's not totally resolved yet. And there are other sites around the state where there's a legacy of farmland that was contaminated through the beneficial reuse program, and should probably get more attention. So next slide. You can skip through these. This just describes how it all operated. So there was an on-site wastewater treatment plant where the leather waste went. Then it was actually trucked to Newaygo Farms where they composted it. And then it was spread on land, and crops were grown on that land. Groundwater irrigated the land, animals ate the food, and then the mortalities, the dead animals, were actually composted back into the leather waste itself. So there were these decades of buildup of PFAS on that particular farm, and that farm is still operating. So they are controlling for the groundwater contamination because that's what MPART has authority over, but they are not testing any of the agricultural products on that land. And it was purchased by Jack Pine Holdings, which interestingly enough used to be a coal company, but now they're getting into the agricultural business, which we'll get into. The animals on that farm have not been tested to see how PFAS might be impacting them. Next slide. So this kind of goes through how that worked. We can skip through it. I think I already described it. This is definitely not the farmer's fault. We should make sure that we are not actually growing crops on contaminated land, that ideally we would limit any sort of livestock exposure to PFAS, avoid the repeated exposure. We are not testing livestock or agricultural products right now for PFAS, although it is highly, highly likely, I would say a definite, you can pretty much just say definitely that our agricultural system is much more impacted by PFAS than we are aware of, because we are not systematically testing agricultural products on land that we know was historically contaminated by PFAS. Okay, next slide. So now I want to get into the link between climate and the expansion of CAFOs. So in our state legislature, and part of the reason we took some time to include this in our presentation on agricultural priorities, our state legislature is considering a state, like a Michigan state low carbon fuel standard. And what that refers to is an attempt to set up a market-based policy that would incentivize ideally, the idea is that you'd incentivize lower carbon fuels, and the money that would be generated on a extra cost on higher carbon fuels is supposed to go towards the electrification of transportation. So it's like this mix of like transportation policy and agricultural policy. But what's happened since the low carbon fuel standard was originally passed in California in 2006, and now we have a federal renewable fuel standard. They both kind of do the same thing. They provide tax dollars to incentivize quote unquote lower carbon fuels, and that's supposed to go towards the electrification of transport. But what's happened is that we've set up these different policy schemes have been functionally captured by industry, and we've wound up incentivizing the practices of anaerobic digestion on CAFOs and also crop-based biofuels. And the accounting that they do to claim that these have a lower carbon intensity is fake math, and I'll get into that. So I think there's a serious issue with biofuels that come from any sort of like plant-based feedstock, but I'm going to talk about CAFO gas and digesters here because they are a very serious problem in Michigan. On Earth Day, I don't know if folks saw some of the reporting, but like bookending Earth Day, there were reports of decreasing water quality, especially in Southeast Michigan, and decreasing air quality. And this is like a, multi-year trend. And a large part of that is due to an expansion that we've seen of CAFOs actually here in Michigan, because of the perverse incentives from California and from the federal government through the renewable fuel standard. So we certainly don't need to like pile on and add more tax dollars to Michigan for that, because what the incentives are doing with low carbon fuel standards in other states is actually incentivizing the build out of CAFOs and corn-based fuels here in Michigan. So how that works with the CAFO expansion, what actually oil companies are doing, and it really is oil. There's a fantastic report that I really encourage everyone to look into. It's by Food and Water Watch, and it tracks the financial ties between big oil and agriculture, and specifically this policy. What they do is they set up anaerobic digesters on CAFOs for the purpose of producing as much methane as possible. So in an anaerobic digester, it's an oxygen-free environment, material breaks down, it produces methane. And that can be injected into current gas infrastructure. You can build out more gas infrastructure, and it can be piped across hundreds of miles and burned. Anaerobic digesters are not inherently bad on small operations or small anaerobic digesters, for example, on restaurants that are going to help process food waste. That's fine. If they are operating properly on wastewater treatment plants, that's great because they can capture methane that would otherwise be released. But what's happening with CAFOs is that we're seeing an absolute explosion of CAFOs for the purpose of producing gas. And there's a entrenched perception that anaerobic digesters on CAFOs are capturing gas that would otherwise be emitted. So therefore, even though we don't like CAFOs, well, at least we're capturing gas that's on them. But what the amazing work of Food and Water Watch and SRAP and Friends of the Earth has shown, especially in recent years, is that we are not seeing anaerobic digesters deployed on existing farms to capture methane, and that's it. What we're seeing is a massive influx of taxpayer subsidies going to build new CAFOs and increase herd size for the explicit purpose of producing more methane, which is a really serious problem. So this is all based on modeling and not measuring. And my mantra over and over again is that we have to just measure and not rely on modeling. And that's because any data that skews the model that would give anaerobic digesters on CAFOs a lower carbon intensity score is excluded. So what that means is that they exclude any data from enteric fermentations, they exclude any data from digestate emissions, they exclude data from the stored methane and the increased herd size, they exclude data from the CO2 and nitrous oxide that's associated from livestock feed. There's no accounting for fugitive methane associated with the transportation of methane that comes from anaerobic digesters. And so there's constant industry claims that these are at least capturing emissions that would otherwise be being emitted, when the actual reality, if we were accounting for the full scope of emissions that are associated with the expansion of CAFOs, we would be talking about a massive increase in emissions. And the increase is obviously a serious problem because it's pretty clear from global data that we are past 1.5 degrees warming. It's incredibly important that we draw taxpayer dollars back from this really perverse incentive. And I want to point out too that the nitrous oxide emissions are a really, really serious problem. Nitrous oxide is actually a more potent greenhouse gas than methane even. And there's absolutely no accounting for the warming associated with nitrous oxide and the dramatic expansion of industrial agriculture. I do have here highlighted the eutrophication of lakes. And the eutrophication of lakes actually increases methane too. And the eutrophication of lakes is directly related to the expansion of CAFOs. And there's some absolutely fantastic research being done by environmentally concerned citizens of Southeast Michigan, where they're working with a researcher at Wayne State to actually sequence DNA from both the Saginaw Bay harmful algal bloom and Lake Erie in order to prove the connection between the expansion of these harmful algal blooms and CAFOs. So there's going to be a DNA trail, and I'm really excited to see that when it is published. So I want to encourage everyone to keep their eyes on that. All right, next slide. So I mentioned it offhand that the ties between big agriculture and big oil, and this relationship has really exploded since around 2015, 2016, and it's dramatically stepped up since the passage of the IRA because of the amount of federal money that is on the table because of the IRA Section 8848 investment tax credit. That's really what's driving it, which is a serious problem, and it was a huge flaw in the IRA. So really important information that folks should know. Shell and BP invested over $6 billion alone. Here in Michigan, the oil company that's investing in anaerobic digesters is Brightmark, which is Chevron. So when we are talking about CAFOs and we're talking about anaerobic digesters, we are talking about Chevron. They've got multiple CAFO manure gas operations in Michigan, and they are spending billions in order to continue to build out the operation. And that's because this industrial scale agriculture fits very well with their existing fossil fuel infrastructure, because it's the same thing. Methane is methane. I think it's really important for the commission to know as well that DTE is heavily investing in dairy CAFO gas. They have multiple anaerobic digesters operating on massive CAFOs in Wisconsin, and that operates under a corporate subsidiary of DTE that is not subject to the Michigan Public Service Commission, so there's not any oversight. It's called DTE Vantage, and you can go check that out. It is public tax dollars that are driving all of this. The math on how expensive it is to install anaerobic digesters does not work in an actual competitive marketplace. The market solution that was supposed to be proposed by a low carbon fuel standard has wound up leading to a total market failure, in which it's tax dollars propping up a business that would otherwise not actually be financially viable. So the last thing that we need to do is pile on and give more Michigan tax dollars to this kind of scheme. And I really encourage the commission to pay close attention to energy providers and where they're getting their energy, because if it is coming from CAFO gas, it is not decreasing emissions, it is increasing emissions, and it's a really serious problem. Next slide. So this is a list of our agricultural priorities broadly for the rest of this legislation and in the future. We want to make sure that we include as many upstream solutions as possible to get PFAS off the market. And I don't have to explain why that's important to folks in Ann Arbor. We want to make sure that we get CAFO gas incentivization out of the Farm Bill. That's a conversation with Senator Stabenow. We should have a CAFO moratorium. Again, water quality is dramatically decreasing in Michigan. The last thing that we need to do is be expanding CAFOs. We need CAFO operator accountability from Eagle. We have an actual law in Michigan that requires CAFOs to get NPDES permits, which means point source pollution permits. And the agricultural industry has been litigating that for years, and we really don't functionally regulate CAFOs. I've been focusing a lot on CAFO gas and the emissions that are associated with the expansion of this industrial kind of agriculture, but it's really important to note that just today, there was a story on NPR about bird flu hopping to humans, and it was in a dairy CAFO worker. So there are a myriad of serious public health implications with this industrial size agricultural operations, and it's pretty alarming to see bird flu jumping to humans in dairy CAFOs. It's not good. So we have a snow-fro ban, which we've been working on for years and pushing, that would ban the application of CAFO manure waste on frozen ground. And one of my personal favorites, we need to deal with our waste disposal loopholes and the beneficial reuse program that I mentioned. So on that note, that's really the suite of Sierra Club agricultural issues right now in the state. I would love to answer any questions that folks have.
Thank you, Christy. That was amazing. And even though I've been exposed to a lot of this, it's like amazing to hear it in that one concentrated discussion. No pun intended. Every time you talk about this farm stuff, it's like you cannot get away from some kind of thing. Well, I have questions, but I really love it when others would start. Are there things that come to mind to you all? Commissioner Mirsky?
Thank you, Chair Mitchell, and thank you, Christy. I want to push you on one point that's maybe a little bit academic, but I'll start out by first saying I agree entirely with all of the concerns that you raise and the solutions that you propose. But the way I understood the thrust of your presentation is that it seems that CAFOs, the primary product of CAFOs is methane. And it seems to me the primary product of CAFOs are animals primarily for human consumption. And those animals produce waste, which produces methane, which is captured, and then by capturing that methane through and producing it through anaerobic digesters, that the revenue from selling that basically reduces the operating costs, the net operating costs of the CAFOs. So it's not really a direct. It's like a how do you call it? Like a we're underwriting, if you will, or we're providing an additional revenue stream to CAFOs. But isn't the real problem our consumption, excessive consumption, unfortunately growing globally consumption of animal meats? Isn't that really a big problem?
Yeah, I am really, really thankful that you asked that question, John. And I think it's an incredibly important question. So the first point that I would point to it's SRAP. This is socially responsible agricultural product. What is it? Project. That's it. They recently put out a report, and I will send it to all of you. I highly recommend reading it, that tracks the increase in herd size and build out of CAFOs directly associated with the establishment of the federal renewable fuel standard and the expansion of low carbon fuel standards in other states. And what this report demonstrates pretty unequivocally is that tax dollars are underwriting agricultural products not for the human consumption of food, but for the explicit production of gas. And there's even some amazing information that's come out of Senator Cory Booker's office, which is wonderful. I've actually been quite surprised by Senator Cory Booker's leadership on this. I did not expect to be reading so much good stuff from him recently. But anyway, he has demonstrated that farmers are now expanding herd size for the production of methane. So this is not about producing food for human consumption. It is about using animals to produce gas that is then captured. And there's some numbers that are really important here. So anaerobic digesters only capture about 1/3 of the methane that is associated with the large, the lagoons of it's basically like sewage, right? So anaerobic digesters capture only that. They do not capture enteric fermentation, which is, basically like the cow burps, right? And cow burps actually account for 3/4 of the emissions of methane emissions from agricultural, and they don't account for the emissions associated with nitrous oxide from agriculture that is primarily associated actually with like the growing corn for feedstock for CAFOs. So we're not producing all of this corn for human consumption. We're producing it for either ethanol or feedstock for CAFOs. And the massive expansion of CAFOs is not to produce food for human consumption. It's actually to produce gas. And that has happened very recently. That was not the case in 2006 when California passed its low carbon fuel standard. It is the case over the past 5 years. So it is all driven by the massive influx of taxpayer dollars. And I really recommend reading this report. I'll make sure that I share it with all of you and you can go through it. Does that help address your question?
Please do so. Yeah, that is astounding.
It is. It really, I was shocked when I read this report. And I think they even underestimated a lot of their claims. That there's another researcher at the University of Tennessee. Her name is Sarah Donofrio, and she was digging into some of the actual permitting data and thinks that their claims are even underestimated. So I will happily share all of that. It's just a wild read. And yeah, I hope that is helpful.
If this line of logic makes sense. So we're taking more and more land to produce animal feed, and the animal feed is contaminated by these products like PFAS and things like that you talked about.
Right, there's that too.
Fertilizing it with petrochemicals, and we're then taking the feed from those crops, sending it to CAFOs, and the primary purpose of those CAFOs is to capture and digest and create the methane that is then sold to these companies. And really, the animal products are secondary. We're not even taking into account at least in the case of beef, the burps and the methane exhaust that way. So if you go all the way back to taking land and putting it into production for all of this, I mean, this just seems insane.
I fully agree, of course. And I think this is a really important point too. Beef cattle are actually, they are mostly grazed. And if cattle are grazing, there's not nearly as much impacts. And usually they're only on those CAFO feedlots at the very end of their life when they're fattened up. The real issue with anaerobic digesters and livestock is dairy CAFOs. So it's less beef and more dairy. That's the real problem here.
Okay. What about hogs and chickens?
They're trying to get anaerobic digesters to work as well. I think North Carolina has some serious issues with hog CAFOs and anaerobic digesters. Chickens are a lot harder to just make it work. And I think the SRAP report goes into why it's just, I mean, it's just an absolute nightmare trying to do it with chickens. But what I'm most familiar with is the dairy industry for two reasons. One, it's huge here in Michigan. Two, in California, there's been a massive explosion specifically of dairy CAFOs because that's actually the best way to produce absolutely massive amounts of sewage that is required to make the anaerobic digesters work at scale. So that's why dairy in particular is really the problem here. And yeah, I think looking at what's actually happened to, I forget which part of California, I'm going to get it wrong and I don't want to get it wrong. But again, this is very recently exploded as a problem within the past 5 or 6 years. And it's because of the perverse financial incentives that are propping up these operations.
My God. Okay. Thank you very much for clearing that up.
Yeah, no problem.
Thanks a lot.
Commissioner Graham?
Well, it's a disappointing commentary on the back room wickedness, I'm going to say, of our federal government. And it's just a new extension of what began with ethanol and corn.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is a crock from the very beginning.
Yeah.
And I'm just dumbfounded this happened. Do we have one of these dairy CAFOs in Washtenaw County?
I am not totally sure, but I do want to flag that there is discussion of opening up a pretty big co-digester somewhere in Washtenaw. Rita, I don't know, you might know more about it. And what co-digesters do is they take waste from lots of different sources because you can't really make anaerobic digestion work unless you have a massive amount of organic material to capture and break down in an oxygen-free environment, right? And I think that the co-digester in Washtenaw County is going to be taking CAPA waste, human waste, food waste, grease, slaughterhouse waste. I mean, just like everything under the sun. I think it will be not great. And I strongly encourage folks to look into the details of that proposed facility. And, any tax incentives it might be getting, what they'd want to do with the gas, what are we talking about here? And I think it points to the importance of zeroing in on phasing out all forms of gas. There is no such thing as a bridge fuel. If you are building gas infrastructure, the intent is to use gas and burn it. It's not a bridge situation. We have to electrify and make sure that we're generating electricity from actual renewable sources. So keep an eye out for that co-digester. Rita, do you know more about it?
I'm just thinking it's Western Washtenaw, but I don't have the absolute, I think I can find out.
Yeah. And I think it would be good to watch. On my to-do list is to go check that out, but there's been some other stuff happening in Lansing that was a little distracting. So
Yeah.
So apart from a failure to regulate of the Department of Agriculture, are there tax dollars from Michigan funding these facilities?
Well, the renewable fuel standard, yes. So there's IRA money and a renewable fuel standard, and there are incentives in the Farm Bill. So our federal tax dollars that have gone to DC, yes. But when it comes to our own state-based low carbon fuel standard, that hasn't passed yet. And we're working really hard to make sure that we either completely exclude manure gas and ethanol from the definition of a low carbon fuel standard. But if we can't do that, then we need to just maintain strong opposition, because that would create like a sixth pot of money that, and remember, when we're talking about these industrial agricultural operations, we're talking about oil companies, right? So we're talking about BP, Chevron, and Shell. They are getting their hands on taxpayer dollars from a variety of different sources in order to build out more gas infrastructure that is powered by livestock. So we really got to make sure that we either strip all those definitions from this Michigan bill or kill it.
Lastly, you said that all the fertilizers at the garden centers have PFAS in them. I understand Milwaukee sewage sludge, but when you mean all, do you mean synthetic fertilizers? Do you mean just the organic things that are there, or what?
If I said all, I misspoke. That is not necessarily true. Any sort of fertilizers that are primarily composed of biosolids from wastewater treatment plants are highly likely to be contaminated. The issue is that fertilizers aren't required to be labeled with that information. So they don't say, oh, this is from the Milwaukee wastewater treatment plant, or this is from Detroit wastewater treatment plant. That's the problem.
Another shortcoming of the Department of Agriculture's regulatory framework. Thank you.
Yep.
Commissioner Nedrick?
Hi, thank you, Christy. That was such an interesting presentation. I just wanted to ask, I have like 3 questions, 2 easy, and the last one will be a little bit harder. So I was wondering if you've met Molly Ripke at the State of Michigan Water Resources Department.
Maybe.
Okay, I highly recommend you have a conversation with her. So she currently is doing all of the E. coli monitoring, and particularly focuses on like Southeast Michigan. So she's doing a lot to regulate and find CAFOs and find where they're applying biosolids. But I think a conversation with her would be really
great. Yeah,
really
I'd love to.
thought-provoking for both of you. Yeah. And I can send you her email if you like.
Yeah, please do. If you know her, I would really love an introduction.
Yeah.
That'd be great.
Yeah.
I'd really appreciate
She's
it.
awesome. She's awesome. So my other question was, I'm terrible at keeping up to date with Michigan laws. You mentioned the PFAS package. Do you know which bill that is? Like the number I can look up?
You know, I do not off the top of my head, but wait there. Hold on. Let me open up my shared drive. And Erica Bloom from the Ecology Center, I'm sure that you guys are familiar with the Ecology Center. She is tracking all of that. Okay, so it looks like there's an introduced Senate Bill 327, which addresses PFAS in food packaging. And oh my God, let's see. This isn't introduced yet. Some are introduced and some are not. I know. You know what? Follow up with me, and I will give you the list of what has been introduced and hasn't. But there's a bill to codify MPART. There's a household product ban, which is really exciting, and there's a bill that addresses insurance coverage. So I will make sure that I get this to you. Or if you know Erica, you could reach out to her. I'm sure she can rattle them off the top of her head.
Okay, sounds good. Okay, my last question. So I know obviously you would never want to operate a CAFO. But say you had to, what would be your preferred way to manage the waste?
They should have on-site wastewater treatment. So CAFOs produce waste like orders of like more sewage than human beings. I think it's like I'll get the number wrong, so I won't cite it, but it is orders of magnitude more waste than like entire cities. And it is, unthinkable at this point to suggest that cities should just like directly discharge untreated human waste into our lakes, rivers, and streams, right? But that is functionally what CAFOs do. The solution is for CAFOs to install on-site wastewater treatment in order to deal with the volume of waste they produce.
Okay, so I mean, just thinking of that, like we have byproducts associated with wastewater treatment plant that in the past have been applied as biosolids. So you still have to do something with those, the sludge that is left over from the treatment plant.
Mhm.
So, I mean, right now we're looking at landfilling that because of the PFAS issue in Ann Arbor. So are you then recommending that they landfill?
We do
Or-
not have enough landfill space. This is why the upstream solution is so important, right? So like ideally use as few toxic products as possible. If your wastewater treatment sludge isn't inherently toxic, it's the waste that goes into the system that is contaminated with all sorts of persistent organic pollutants that's the problem. So the on-site wastewater treatment and then as much upstream control for any sort of bioaccumulative contaminants is ideally what we would be doing. And like to your point, we should move as much away from CAFOs as much as possible. But if they're there, they should be doing on-site wastewater treatment plants.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
Christy, I want to ask about a little bit about what your really hot topic now, and that has to do with data centers and potential for those data centers that are under discussion for being incentivized for the state to also contribute to an increase in CAFOs. Is that something that we should think about?
So I'm not sure if the commission has been tracking this at all, but when we're talking about data centers, we're talking about the massive server farms that tech
That's right.
companies need in order to, I mean, they're exploding because of the build out of AI. And they use an absolutely massive amount of electricity. So for example, the concentration of data centers in Northern Virginia uses the equivalent amount of electricity required by 6 million homes. So we will not be able, the pace that they are building out data centers is not going to be matched by the current amount of electricity that we have, and we are continuing to increase. So I think that it is likely that if there is a big build out of data centers in Michigan that is not associated with a requirement for them to seriously invest a lot of money in building out utility scale renewables, that they will get as much energy as they can from all sources, including, but not limited to, probably manure gas. And one of the serious shortcomings in our renewable energy legislation was the inclusion of manure gas in Senate Bill 271 as a source of renewable energy. We fought that. We did not win. And it's a problem because, as I said during the presentation, the build out of CAFOs is an increase overall in greenhouse gas emissions. It is not cutting greenhouse gas emissions. So I think it's a little bit difficult to say that there is going to be like a direct one-to-one relationship between CAFO gas and data centers. But I think that the overall demand of data centers is going to be really difficult for absolutely everyone to meet. So we have to make sure that we're mandating that if they're coming to Michigan, they are building out themselves as much renewable energy as possible.
And this might seem really simplistic, but could you be more specific about your comment about upstream and avoiding upstream?
Yeah. I think part of the reason why I'm so interested in the fate of wastewater treatment sludge is because the only real policy solution is making sure that we are putting as few toxic products on the market as possible, because it is actually, it's not from an engineering perspective, from a policy perspective, it is actually impossible to make our waste not toxic if everything that has gone into it is toxic. So there is no good solution for what to do with wastewater treatment plant sludge once it is contaminated. We actually can't break down PFAS. There's been a few interesting things happening in laboratories, but they are not at scale, and it's just not a viable solution because of all sorts of production issues of PFAS. But so we landfilling it is not an option. We're going to run out of space. Incinerating it, nightmare. Obviously, we don't want to dump it in the ocean. Seriously, those are the options. So we have to make it as non-toxic as possible so that when we do land apply it, it is not contaminating groundwater and the food supply.
Commissioner Just.
I want to thank you very much for this incredibly informative presentation, and I'm really glad that Chair Mitchell arranged this for us. I do want to make sure to get the report you mentioned.
Yeah.
And you have what I've learned this evening has given me a number of questions that I will want to be asking about the use of methane gas as a transition fuel.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you're excited to ask those questions, and I really encourage them. I think in particular, the exclusion of data that the models don't like, right, is really alarming. And I really encourage you guys to ask some really tough questions about the actual quantifiable, measurable emissions that are associated with this kind of agriculture.
Right. And I guess one of the things that I noticed was that, I mean, it's like calling something carbon negative is really problematic because it just admits what you're saying, right?
Right. And I actually didn't even cover that, but because I just like talking about all of the emissions that they just leave out that make the model not work, right? Because I feel like that says enough. But on top of all the emissions that they just don't bother to quantify, they actually give CAFO gas a positive, well, it's not positive, it's a negative score because they're trying to get a negative CI, but they throw in a made up number associated with quote unquote avoided emissions. So they like give the entire operation props, assuming that it would be built without the taxpayer dollars. I mean, it would be like saying, oh, we're going to call the gas that is produced by this BP refinery opening up, we're going to give them an extra score because they are avoiding emissions by capturing them on site or something like that. Instead of saying this never should have been built in the first place, we don't need this source of greenhouse gas emissions adding to our problems. It's pretty wild. It's a pretty wild way to do fake math. I mean, it's fake math. They're making up numbers. It's crazy.
Well, looking for anyone else? This is a great opportunity to talk with someone who really knows what's going on. And I'll just pause for a second. And Christy, just thank you so much for this information and also for your tireless work for us in the state to keep our air, water, and land clean and to help protect our public health. It's really, really important. And you're a great leader. Thank you.
Thanks, Rita. I appreciate it. And I appreciate the work that everyone here is doing. I will make sure to get those reports to Rita and she can share them all with you. And one of the really key authors is actually from Michigan, Lynn Henning. And she will happily come take you around Lenawee County and talk to you about her 30 years of advocacy against industrial agriculture in her backyard. And if anyone on the commission is interested in coming and talking to Lynn Henning, I really recommend it. She's a little bit of a national treasure, in my opinion.
Yes, she is. All right. Well, thanks again.
Thanks.
Christy.
I'll leave you guys for now. Thank you. Appreciate the invite.
Have
Take
a
care.
good evening and
You too.
We'll see you.
Bye.
Bye-bye. All right. Thanks, everyone. I hope that you appreciated that dense bit of information. It brings to the fore, in my mind, the great importance not only of, another piece of upstream that we didn't mention here is like, what are the choices we make in food, right? We've been talking about a more vegetable-based diet. This is yet another reason to help avoid some upstream, to not put pressure for CAFO-based food into the system as well, and to not give cover to an operation that it does not deserve. There are also animal rights issues, worker issues, emission of gas in local environments, neighbors around some of these farms that are really serious. But anyway, thank you for your time and attention on this. So I'm going to move now to our next item on our agenda, which is the reports from our committees and commissions, etc. So I'm going to start with biodiversity and look to Commissioner Curtis.
Okay, a few things to talk about. We finished up the Pollinator Aware Yard Care website information, and we also finished up the information for Sean for the Pollinator Corner topic so they can start doing a monthly blurb going out in different newsletters. And we started discussion of a couple of new topics, biodiversity event for large property owners, to see if we can get something like that set up. And also natural features in the comprehensive plan. What do we want there? So just some new topics we're starting to work on there. That's it.
Great, thanks. The next group is circular economy. And it would be you, John Callowart, possibly? All right, thank you.
Sure. Not much to report. The working group kind of wrapped up our current phase of work around construction and demolition. Currently, city staff, Sarah Mason and Jenny Petoskey, are working on compiling that into a presentation that they first want to take around other city staff and get their input on it. And eventually, perhaps sometime this summer, would bring it back to the Environmental Commission for input on kind of what we learned and what we think some next steps are. Lisa, anything to add to that?
I have a question, John. Is this your last meeting?
Yes.
Oh my gosh. Well, I just want to be sure that everyone knows, because some of you have been on this commission a long time, but others not. Just what a driving force, John Callowart, you have been. And so in my 4 years, you predate me, but in my 4 years, you have motored what we are now calling the Circular Economy Working Group.
Thank you, Lisa.
It's been such a pleasure. And I think that, just go to the web. I mean, there's so many things that we accomplished with John, including working with a great team of C's students on circular economy in Ann Arbor. So it's laying the groundwork for a new strategy piece of A20, and I couldn't be more grateful and sorry for you to go.
Thank you. It was a good COVID project, right? We started this in terms of deep COVID and weekly meetings and doing what we could. And yeah, glad to have been able to contribute to it. Thanks.
I want to add my thanks to John, and thank you very much for being here as long as I've been on this commission as well. It's been great to have a solid person available. And we appreciate your work. Great. Water. Steve is not here. I don't know, Sarah, if you want to comment on anything. I'll just say that the Gelman Plume is still moving forward, right? And the comment period for the EPA national priorities listing has been closed. There is an NPDES permit review coming up, I believe, with a hearing soon. Trying to think of the date. It's coming up. Cannot remember, but I can send
June
it around.
20th.
Ah, thanks. Just what I need. I knew there was a 20. Yeah, so that's something that you all may be interested in joining in on. All right, I'm going to move to other commissions, and I'll start with energy. Oh, I'm sorry, Lisa, did you have a comment?
Actually, I did. Now, I don't remember if we remembered to say this, or possibly you didn't completely know this, but did everybody know that the city reopened, or the city took legal action related to the settlement agreement with Gelman that was reached in 2006? And that part of that settlement agreement was it included some monitoring wells that Gelman never put in the ground. For one thing, because these monitoring wells, if enough dioxin is detected in them, will trigger a cash payment from Gelman. So they somehow didn't get around to installing them. So the city took legal action, and Gelman has installed, I think, a couple, not all three yet, but a couple of those wells, which is another step. It's one of the things as we wait for the EPA to approve taking up the site and then taking over the cleanup of the site. It's just another step that we can have locally in a way to hold Gelman accountable. So that was a really pleasing result from the litigation pathway, which is mostly now moot because of EPA's action, which is of course welcome.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Okay, I'll move now to energy with John Mirsky.
Yes. First of all, I want to also add my thanks to John. I've worked with John on solid waste and circular economy activities for quite some time, and we're going to miss you, John. And I hope you're not just quote unquote retiring, but moving on to something bigger and better than the Environmental Commission with a bigger impact. So we hope to hear about that someday. As far as the Energy Commission is concerned, two major activities. First of all, we began but did not complete discussions and commission reactions and input on the city administrator's memo with recommendations for incentivizing energy efficient and all electric building construction. So once we have some conclusions on that, I'll be happy to share those, but we're not at that point yet. That'll hopefully be in our next meeting or maybe the one after that. And the other thing is that we elected a new chair, replacing Claire McDonough, who's stepping down to concentrate on our PhD studies. And that is Gabriel or Gabe Harp. And some of you might know him in his professional capacity at the University of Michigan. He's the director of research and creation practice development at Taubman College, College of Architecture. So we have a new chair. So those are the two main topics that we covered at our last meeting. Thanks.
Great, thanks. And John, the energy efficiency incentive program is one that we had discussed here as well, right?
Correct.
As I recall, and I think that we didn't probably spend as much time on it as you all have, and I'll be very interested in hearing what the Energy Commission says.
Sure.
Councilmember Dish.
Question. Are you talking about the memo that we received from City Administrator Dohoney in either late December or early January, or are you talking about
mid-January? Yes, that memo.
Okay, well, it might be a good idea to focus instead, or at least in addition to, on John Fournier's memo. It's one of
I know also you council passed 4 resolutions that cover part of that. And I submitted a number of questions and they were not answered. And that's why we didn't finish the discussion on the topic. So yes, we recognize that.
Okay, so you recognize that the 4 economic development memos are actually more comprehensive and went further than Mr. Dohoney's memo. Okay, great. Thank you.
Yep.
Next we have Parks, and I'm glad to see that you're still here. I know that you have a new role in Parks as well, as chair, and so I'm happy to see you, but I have this feeling that perhaps we may be seeing a change, so we'll ask you that question.
Nothing imminent yet.
Okay.
Still need to encourage some folks to step forward and from Parks, but yeah, we just met on Tuesday. The big piece of business was the millage, the Parks millage. So we voted to recommend that City Council recommend putting or agree to putting a renewal for the Parks millage at 1.1 mils for 20 years on the November ballot. And then we had a few other items, just an update on West Park and the band shell. Apparently there's a lot of neighborhood and community support for the band shell. And so the consultants will be looking into, how to move it or build a new band shell, or, whatever the recommendations are going to be. we accepted a Fair Food Networks grant for the farmers market to support low-income folks to be able to buy produce there. And we recommended approving an easement for DTE for some overhead power lines in Mary Beth Doyle Park. And that is it. Looks like I got questions.
Commissioner Mirsky.
Thank you. Yep, thanks. The millage renewal, is that at the same millage rate as the current rate, or was there a discussion of any decision on raising that millage rate?
Yeah, what staff recommended was maintaining the current millage rate. So no change there, 1.1 mils. What they recommended was going from the last 3 millages have been for 6 years. This time around, we decided to go for 20 years because it provides a little more stability in planning over that period of time, knowing that we're going to have that funding available. My understanding is that there's not a lot of room within the millage allotments, and I don't know a ton about this topic, but I know there are some limits on how many mills different bodies can they have to work with, and so my understanding is there's not a lot of wiggle room in the within the city to raise that millage rate.
That's also my understanding, is that we're bumping up against the ceiling. Maybe one of the council members can talk to that. But the concern that I have is that it's at least my perception that there is a significant amount of deferred maintenance, if you will, on public parks. That was somewhat mitigated by some Reconstruction Act funds. For example, the bridge at Gallup Park was replaced with that, although I guess that's maybe capital improvement project funding. But then we also have the structural issue that the green belt is generating additional funds, and 1/3 of those funds have to be used for the purchase of new parkland. So while the acreage of that new parkland is probably not that significant, just because it's getting more and more expensive, and there's less and less to buy. Nevertheless, we're adding parkland. We see inflation that's hitting costs also for Parks and Rec. And we basically have a scissors effect where unless the millage generates a lot more revenue because property values are going way up, or cumulative property values are going up, we're in a situation where we're going to be doing less and less with our parks. And I think one example of that is something we've talked about here, and that is NAP now is only actively managing about 400 acres of its land. And we've talked also about the frequency of controlled burns, and those have dropped from about 150 acres a year down to roughly 60 acres a year. There's been a little bit of a bump up again this year, but nevertheless, it's still substantially lower than what it had been in the past. So I'm wondering if by recommending a millage increase that is flat, that we're just not going to see a bigger and bigger problem in terms of our ability to maintain our parks and to put on the kinds of programs that people in Ann Arbor would expect.
Yeah, no, I agree with your concerns that there are a lot of maintenance issues on the horizon within the parks. I think part of the reason for going for a 20-year millage, it allows us the stability to go after some other types of funding that require things like matching funds. It's going to provide us the possibility for doing for issuing bonds against the millage. And I don't know a ton about that topic either, but my understanding is that it with the stability of the millage and the fact that we don't have a lot of wiggle room to increase that millage significantly, it does provide us with the stability we might need in order to attract other types of grant funding, state dollars, federal dollars, and that sort of thing. So I think going forward, the Parks Department is looking at, you know, what are other options for paying for the kinds of amenities that we'd like to have within the city of Ann Arbor.
Well, I can understand the 20 years because that's an enabler when it comes to attracting those funds. I guess I'm questioning locking ourselves in to a millage rate, effectively locking ourselves in. I suppose there could be a proposal to increase the millage at some future point in time. But it seems to me it's most likely that the practical effect will be likely that we lock ourselves in for 20 years. And if we don't attract those funds, then we're really stuck. Because as I said, you know, parkland and facilities are continuing to increase with the Greenbelt funds, and we have mounting issues with invasives. We have expectations in terms of maintaining the kinds of services, you know, the kinds of programs, the deliveries and things like that. You know, we saw even just with the golf carts and things like that, those kinds of costs, the way we'd like to do it with electric golf carts are higher, and their operating costs are apparently also higher. So I just wonder about the prudence of doing that.
Yeah, no, we did bring that topic, that issue up, that, you know, over 20 years now, you're kind of locking yourself into a rate. But I think the decision was that this was the way to go forward for the time being. But I certainly am happy to bring your concerns back to the Parks Department. Yeah.
And council needs to consider that then finally when they vote on whether or not to continue the millage at the current rate.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, a lot of other things that we've talked about, like deer cull and things like that, that potentially could be covered under the Parks and Rec department, I would think. So I don't know. I'm concerned about what we're locking ourselves into for the next 20 years.
Thank you.
Commissioner Graham?
John, you're a treasure, and I share your concerns, as you very well know. And thanks for your Parks Commission leadership. It's really been great to have a durable friend on the Environmental Commission from Parks. It's not you, of course. It's the structural deficit of the city that's behind all of this. And it's not really Environmental Commission business, but when something like the parks budget seems to be, well, perhaps I say low man on the totem pole as far as funding is concerned. I think the effect of inflation these last few years has been obvious. It certainly has been for the NAP program. It seems to me that the city needs to address the structural funding problem. And this is much more than a parks issue. I'm just going to put this on the table. Maybe we can make it a subject of an Environmental Commission meeting where we get really well informed so that we can inform our neighbors and friends. Maybe it's time for some proposals. Clearly, we're building big buildings, and that's helping our tax income. I don't know if it's going to work out in the end, but Mr. Headley got a law passed in the state that capped the rate at which properties can be taxed relative to their market value and until the property sells. And that's very beneficial to all of us who have lived here a long time and have owned property for a long time. It's fairly tough on city budgets. I'm thinking of Ypsilanti, where they have a much smaller tax base and really are closed in by these problems. We're more, and we have a growing body of land in the city that's not on the tax base. Every couple of weeks we hear about something being sold to the university.
Yep.
Somehow, not too long in the future, we really need to all come together and do something about this. Hank, man, it's not you. It's a much bigger problem.
So I have just one quick question, and my concern, I guess, with the 20-year time period for the millage, doesn't the millage rate decrease over the years so that by the time we get to 20 years that the actual millage amount is decreased because of this Hadley design? Is that correct?
No.
Lisa's nodding. Okay, that makes me a little worried too. Because if perhaps it may be better to renew it more frequently so that it doesn't get down really low. I don't know what the projections are for the 20th year compared to the first, but that would be a concern I have.
If that's true, then I'm really going to stand up and object to this course of action. Never mind the grants and programs we can apply for. We get hurt in that deal. We, parks.
Well, every millage gets hurt. So
right.
Affordable housing gets hurt.
Got to do something about this.
Yeah.
Great. Well, thanks, Anne. And thanks for continuing to be here with us. All right, Planning Commission. Report from planning. Lisa, I'm sorry to look at you again. I know that we're seeking a person to sit in.
I'm trying to think if we've done anything that would be interesting. I don't think so. Yeah, I mean, the only thing that we did the other night was we talked about a new project. It's a pre-PUD conference for a project that's going to make an improvement on Ann Street and Ann Court, or sorry, Mary Street and Mary Street and Mary Court, all these streets named after women. And it's going to involve taking down 4 single family homes and doubling the number of units, number of residential units, but doing a sort of an attached townhome structure. It's going to be all one building, but there'll be townhomes with porches and stuff. And we are, the Circular Economy Working Group is working on connecting this developer with someone who might be able to salvage some of the materials in those single family homes, because it's just, it's not typical when we rip down a really, really old, broken down multifamily apartment building. There's not much in there worth salvaging, but there might be things in these houses that someone could reuse. So we're just doing a little sort of informal construction and demolition pilot, and it may come to nothing because we may not be able to find someone to help salvage, but that's something that I think you all would be interested in. And we looked at our work plan and it's ridiculous. And yeah, so I'll keep you posted when work on those economic development amendments, which has sustainability work in them. I'll keep you posted on when that gets scheduled and move forward by planning.
Thanks. And you know that I watched and commented on a recent project that was approved for an amendment that includes some methane from agriculture in its plan for energy, and that's, for me, it still is a concern based on the information we heard tonight. So I hope that gets a little more discussion. Yeah, thanks. Okay, transportation. I think that I need to look to Councilmember Ackman.
Well, I'm no longer on transportation, but what I can tell you is that something that City Council passed several months ago, calling on MDOT to work with the ride on a different option for US 23 stretch instead of adding a lane. That's they announced today that they will not be adding a lane, and they will be looking at improving it, the bridge that actually kind of connects neighborhoods, better bike infrastructure. They're also going to be looking at increasing the shoulder so that the bus could use the shoulder as a high speed unobstructed lane. State law would need to change to make that happen. But anyway, yay, a lot of activism went on around that. So just happy to see it.
Good.
And then while you have me, I'll just remind people that our leaf blower, gas powered leaf blower phase in starts on June 1st, meaning June 1st to October 1st.
Phase out. Gas powered leaf blower phase out.
That's what I said, isn't that what I said?
I said phase in.
Phase out. Sorry. Anyway, yes, phase out. So folks should not be using gas powered leaf blowers starting June 1st until the fall. And that goes until 2028, at which point no gas powered leaf blowers. So hopefully your neighborhoods will be a little bit quieter. And we also, at our council meeting, I think since the last time we met, passed a resolution to put the SEU ballot language on for November 2024. I think that was between the last meeting and this. So that's moving forward too.
Great. Commissioner Graham.
Just a little feedback. The most powerful gas backpack blowers cost about $800. The most powerful electric backpack leaf blower costs about $2,000, including batteries and chargers. And believe me, you go through a lot of batteries in a day. The most powerful backpack leaf blower currently pushes about 70% of the amount of air that the most powerful gas one does. We haven't gotten to the point yet where the technology meets the standard being the performance of a gas-powered leaf blower. Hopefully by 2028, when that power is needed for the fall's leaves, we're okay. Out in the field, there are almost no contractors with electric machines. I have them. And the university is beginning to take them on, even lawnmowers and spin trimmers and a lot more of these appliances we really need to change. The other problem about electric stuff is you have to have a covered vehicle. You can't go out in the rain with this stuff and not have troubles, needless to say. So it's not all wine and roses yet. I wish you all done more than just leaf blowers, because that kind of smacks of we don't like the noise, rather than really doing what we can do, which is phase out a lot of this stuff. The big lawnmowers, the big riding lawnmowers being the toughest one. But in any case, for a homeowner, such as myself, all by myself, I'm all electric. That completely made the shift. The homeowner size materials work great. Still not good in the fall if you live in a wooded part of the city. Just some feedback.
I just want to add a pitch to leave the leaves as much as possible, especially on non-mowed areas, because they are very good for pollinators and other wildlife. So these things can fit together, I hope, in the future. And I think that we will also, one of the other outcomes for this will be cleaner air, very specifically. Okay. Is there any other report that council members would like to make while we're on this? Lisa or Dharma? And if not, Okay, thank you. So I just want to acknowledge that and thank council for the budget that you passed with the phase 2 study for the Ann Arbor for Public Power study of electrification, or looking for an alternate method of managing electricity for our city in the future. And I also want to say that I've appreciated being chair, and I look forward to our next item after the report from Aaron, election of our next chair. Aaron, do you want to comment on anything from your staff report? And thank you for providing it in writing.
Sure, yeah, there's there's a few links in there regarding some upcoming activities around. So 820 week is going to be June 9th through 15th. So there's a link to check that out. This one's a little dated, but we did launch More Life, Less Stuff on Earth Day. So there's a link to check that out as well. And then I posted the link, Rita, you mentioned this about Gelman, the public comment for the NPL listing. I did also, now in my report, I wanted to mention that the wastewater treatment plant, actually it's timely, just completed a phase 2 feasibility study on an anaerobic digester. And I think they're tentatively scheduled to present to the Energy Commission in June. So I was going to forward that along to this commission if anyone's interested in attending. But there's some, some potential environmental benefits from the anaerobic digester, but there is a large capital cost. And so the consultant will be presenting on those issues at that.
Thank you. I think after our presentation that we heard tonight, it would be interesting to kind of explore some of the issues that were raised as well. And I know it's a different kind of thing, and but we need to know all of it, right, as we move forward.
Yes, and I did just want to confirm the city's not land applying biosolids anymore. I don't know if there was a question about that, but just to confirm. So
yeah, but we
thank
did
you.
for a while, right? As
did
far
for a
as I
while,
know, our
yes.
history. Yeah.
Yes, correct.
Yeah. Okay. All right. I would like to now call our attention to election of officers for the next year starting in June. Oh, and also to acknowledge and thank reappointments for Commissioners Dale, Weihang, and Graham. Thank you for continuing to serve, and I'm pleased that you're remaining on the commission. It's really good. Okay, so Aaron, if you could help just announce the any candidates for chair. Let's start with chair.
Sure. We had Commissioner Curtis step up to volunteer to be chair for next year.
All right. Yay. So I think we have to have a motion. And first off, an acceptance. So Commissioner Curtis, do you accept the potential to be elected into your position?
Yes, I do.
Okay, thanks. And so I'd like a motion to elect Commissioner Curtis as chair of the Environmental Commission. Commissioner Mursky, thank you. And a second from Commissioner Dale, thank you. And so any discussion of this? Probably is when I should have asked if you accept. And all in favor?
Well, maybe real quickly, are there any other nominations?
Thank you.
I sent out a request for people to submit names and nomination, but we should probably also open the floor for additional nominations just in case.
You're correct. Is there anyone else who would like to serve as chair of the Environmental Commission? To talk you through about it. All right. I see no hands. I would like to proceed with the motion. Thank you for raising the issue. Okay, all in favor of Commissioner Curtis as our chair for the next year? Raise your hand. I see. Oh, okay. Any? Okay, good. This looks like unanimous. Thank you.
Good job, Brooke. Good job, Rita. You were just getting really terrific at your job, Rita.
Now I'm going to be not terrific.
I mean, you've just grown leaps and bounds in this last year or two.
Well, thanks. It's y'all are the best to work with, and I appreciate it. So we need a vice chair, and I believe that Aaron has heard from one person at least. And Aaron, our potential candidate.
I've heard from that Commissioner Brown is interested in the vice chair position.
Okay.
I've
Is
not heard from
anyone
anyone else.
else present also interested in serving as vice chair? We could have a runoff. All right. Would anyone like to move Vice Chair Brown to continue as vice chair? Commissioner Mirsky, seconded by Commissioner Dale. Thank you. All in favor of Commissioner Brown returning as vice chair? Raise your hand. I see unanimous. Thank you, everyone. I appreciate this. We've got 3 minutes. We're going to squeak by, perhaps. With our meeting. We are now, and Commissioner Curtis, I assume that you will proceed with taking over at the next meeting, in which case I'll send you all of the information on how to introduce and everything like that. Okay, thanks. Okay, so this is our chance now for our second public commentary. People can speak for up to 3 minutes. Please call 888-788-0099 and enter meeting ID 962-0336-6453. City staff will select callers that have raised their hand by calling out the last 3 digits of their phone number. In order to electronically raise your hand, please press *9 on your phone. You'll hear an automated announcement that the host is allowing you to speak. Please, at that point, press *6 to unmute your phone. When speaking, please move to a quiet area and mute any television or background sounds so that we may hear you clearly. Please state your name and address at the beginning of your comments. And Aaron, do we have any hands raised?
No callers tonight.
No callers. All right. I'd like to entertain a motion to adjourn from Commissioner Mirsky. Do you have a comment, Commissioner Mirsky?
I have a quick question. I think we're supposed to talk about agenda or items for the next agenda.
You're right. Oh, geez. Okay.
I think you go over that. And I just wanted to request that in light of the solid waste budget that was posted to Legistar for this meeting for the first 9 months of this year, that we make sure that we get a review of that budget when the budget year is up. I just want to point out that we're 9 months in, or 75%. Expenses are coming in only at 49% of budget, whereas revenue is coming in at 78% of budget. And the delta is a net positive of over $6 million year to date, which would presumably go to the solid waste fund. And that would be the 3rd year in a row where you've had a large surplus. And I think it would be really important to talk about solid waste and the budgeting and what we do with the solid waste fund, et cetera, et cetera. That's all. Thanks.
Sounds good. Great. Thank you. Any other suggestions for future agenda items? Seeing none. All right. Is there a motion to adjourn? Commissioner Mirsky, seconded by Commissioner Wayhing. All in favor of adjourning? Adjourn again. All right. Thank you all. Thank you.
Rita.
Good night. It's been fun. I'll be
Thanks.
here.